Okay, let's make a start. So, good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining the webinar today. So, this webinar is being hosted by the Interdisciplinary Global Development Centre, also known as IGDC, here at the University of York. And my name is John Enser. I'm a prof at the Stockholm Environment Institute and director of the IGDC here at York. So, IGDC is an interdisciplinary research community where we strive for equitable global development. IGDC undertakes interdisciplinary research, as the name suggests, and we have three research themes broadly focusing around social justice, global health, and sustainable environments. So this really, the purpose of the centre is to bring together researchers from across the humanities and social sciences and the natural sciences, so from across our three faculties here at York, to work together and to work with partners globally. So we encourage researchers to work with one another and with policymakers and with practitioners in the pursuit of contributing towards thought and action in relation to global development challenges. Before I introduce the panel, a couple of housekeeping points. Recording first, so the session's being recorded, but only the video. Only the video and audio of the panelists. Attendees, your mics are muted and your video is off, so you won't be recorded. The only information that may be recorded are any questions that you type in, which could be identifiable based on your Zoom name, so please keep that in mind. Q&A, to ask questions, please use the Q&A button that should be in the bottom bar of your Zoom screen. Panelists will answer questions submitted through the Q&A, so don't use the chat for that, please. Questions can be voted on, so if someone asks a question that you were intending to ask or that you'd really like to hear a response on, then please vote it up, and those questions with the most votes will get answered first. Twitter, I think we're supposed to call it X now, aren't we? Those using Twitter or X can find and follow IGDC on the handle at York_IGDC. And for the webinar, apparently we're using the hashtag IGDC webinar. Tech support, if you're having any technical issues, thanks Leanne. Leanne's just put the Twitter handle into the chat. Any technical issues, use the chat function to talk to the host, please. So that's questions in the Q&A and tech issues in the chat, essentially. So to introduce the and welcome our panel. So first of all, Ed Atkins. So Ed's senior lecturer in geographical scientists at the University of Bristol. He worked on the contested character of environmental and energy policy and politics, and has brought his thinking together in a recent book, which is, if I have this correct, Ed, do correct me if I'm wrong, entitled A Just Energy Transition. So this explores how localized, democratic and place-based approaches might allow for more equitable energy transitions and climate action. We also have Aurora Gans, who is a lecturer at Queen Mary University. We have Josh Kirshner, who's a senior lecturer in human geography here at York in the Department of Environment and Geography. And last but not least, we have Barnaby Dye, who's a lecturer again at York, but from the Department of Politics and International Relations. And he also has a book in progress, which is focusing on the politics of dam building in Africa, I believe. Barnaby, again, correct me if I'm wrong. So with those brief introductions, because I don't really want to take up more time than necessary, as the panelists, I'm sure, will give a fuller account of their interests and thinking in the talks that you're about to hear, I will hand over to Ed, who's going to give us the first of this morning's four talks. Ed, over to you.
Thank you, John, for the kind introduction, and thank you to University of York and the IGDC for inviting me to this panel. I hope you can all hear me and can see some slides on a screen. If not, just start waving at a camera somewhere and I'll fix it. I'm really excited to be here today to present a work in progress paper. This is going to be the last time I think I present this before I write it up. So now is the time to ask those difficult questions that might help with that process. It's around GB News as a media source in the UK, and in particular how it's becoming a particularly pivotal part of culture wars and class antagonisms in a discursive sense around climate action. This isn't necessarily successful or important or significant, but it is an emergent discourse which we're seeing both in the media but also politics as well today. And I'd like to talk through some preliminary findings of this work. Now, look, this work has its roots in previous work for me, which is basically around how certain items, household items or outside the household, but items which are everyday and quite banal, can become almost lightning rods for broader culture war discussions and political antagonisms. These include things like gas stoves. This time last year, there was a huge outcry in the Republican Party at what was, in short, a federal official misspeaking and saying that they were thinking about regulating domestic gas stoves for public health reasons. We can see in some of the tweets on the slide I've got on the screen that, we saw the tropes coming through. They can have my gas stove if they take it out of my cold, dead hands. And there's always a nice narrative to have when it comes to public health regulation. But this kind of this is the roots for the work that I'm doing. And from this event in 2023, I started thinking about how particular media sources are constructing new antagonisms around everyday items or everyday events, and how they are increasingly class-based as well, and how that opens up different understandings of class, but also of working class environmentalism. To give some other examples from recent months as well, you can see the farmers' protests in France, based around central government changes to regulations around what can be used on the farm, but also having wider roots in the rural-urban divide and in terms of infrastructure and equality, but also in Italy the destruction and the vandalism of speed bumps, both things which are seemingly, well, speed bumps in particular every day, based around how we consume in terms of how we get from A to B, but are becoming sites of antagonism and contest and contradictions. Josh is going to be talking about his paper soon, but I think it's really important here to reflect on how infrastructure is a space for imaginaries as well, and how we can see even this everyday infrastructure, the imaginaries are taking place and they're being contested. And this accumulation of different meanings around certain forms of infrastructure doesn't necessarily deprive them of their potential in terms of radical change, or also radical antagonism and contest as well. So the emptiness does not negate any potential, and the variety of meanings does not negate the radical potential that these things can hold. And I think it's important to start rooting our understanding of these events in this antagonism between the people and broader environmental and climate action. We can see in recent work by colleagues about how there's an importance of common sense in a Gramscian sense, and a will of the people in the current state of far-right discourse, basically asserting it is us versus them, and you and I are together in our antagonism with an elite who is holding us back from fulfilling our identity. Now, that can take many forms. That can be in the form of COVID lockdowns. That can be in the form of environmental policy. It can be in the form of public health measures, but all of which are seen as withholding people from their identity and doing what they want to do. So what I'm intrigued by when it comes to this work is, how is climate action becoming part of this? We've seen various other policies become part of a broader lightning rod for antagonism of the right and the far right. But how is climate policy now being positioned in that? And what does that mean in terms of an emergent or a changing class antagonism? Because when we think about this antagonism in class terms, it is often a conscious choice to draw different classes in and build a broader coalition. We've seen that happen in the past in France, in the changes of the National Rally Party under Jean-Marie Le Pen from the 1980s onwards, and we can see it happening more and more now as well. So in the UK, This is often around things like the Net Zero Scrutiny Group, which is a parliamentary, kind of informal parliamentary group with its roots in the European Research Group, which was linked to Brexit and quite a vocal voice in the Brexit negotiations, but also outside of government as well. Net Zero Watch is a new name for the Global Warming Policy Foundation. Nigel Farage is always involved, and he staged several campaigns around calling for referenda on net zero policies. But then broader organisations and journalists, and in particular, in my mind, TV and GB News. Now, GB News is, I'm sure, not going to be a new thing for many of you to hear about. It's a disruptive media broadcaster. It was set up from 2021 onwards. After a tumultuous first 2 years, it seems to kind of be at a point now when it's got a brand identity and quite a stability in how it presents itself. It is the home to many right-wing political figures and many conservative MPs, and is often seen as the hub of right-wing political journalism and narrative in the UK. It pushes back against what is seen as a bias in mainstream broadcasting and is quite open in its political statements, often resulting in huge amounts of complaints to Ofcom, the UK media regulator. Now, it's important to note that the monthly viewers share of GB News is not high. However, it is incredibly active online. Josh and I were speaking just before this webinar about how, if you watch YouTube, GB News will come up no matter what your algorithm is. It is a well-pitched media source using short, sharp videos which report certain talking points on the topics of the day. In many ways, in my mind, it is almost targeting these outputs as a way to spread its news, but also to increase its reach. So this project that I'm talking to you about today is basically thinking around how GB News presents new climate policy and action in the UK, and how it often uses logics of equivalence and difference, but importantly, how it positions new policies or new schema as a terrain of antagonism. It is about how class terms are being used to explore new emergent policies. And I'm looking at this in terms of one policy and one broader event, thinking about the 2023 expansion of the London ultra-low emission zone, but also Just Stop Oil protests. So to do this, it was through collection of GB News YouTube videos in particular, because of that reach online, and then starting to code them in terms of what they say and how they position things in certain terms. To give you just a brief window into kind of when and how much reach these kind of views, these sources had. On the screen, you'll see the blue dots are for views of ULEZ related videos, and the yellow dots are for Just Stop Oil. The red lines are denoting a process in which ULEZ made national news and other media sources as well, due to the Azerbaijan Rice-led by-election, which the Conservative Party won against expectations, and also High Court decisions before the expansion of ULEZ itself. So you can see this clustering of the blue around that. The yellow is much more spread across the year. It does often correspond with Just Stop Oil protests, but it's worth noting that Just Stop Oil was staging a summer of disruption in July 2023, and we don't necessarily see a huge amount of clustering around that. So there's not as much of a illustrative pattern for Just Stop Oil videos, I guess. They're more of a slow burn across the year. Going up on this figure is the number of views these videos received, and this was at the point of collection. So on the slide, we've got the top viewed one was 670,000 views. I have actually removed what was the top viewed video because it really skewed this graph. But a short video of a man punching a Just Stop Oil protester received 1.7 million views on YouTube. These are the types of videos that are being put out there and being reported on and gaining these views. So let's start digging in to what they're saying. And when you look at the coding of ULEZ videos in particular, we can see a number of themes emerging. Sadiq Khan was seen as the primary figure behind this. policy. It is a personal policy of his. He's recently written a book called Breathe, which is about the fight against urban air pollution. But importantly, Sadiq Khan was not directly linked to the Labour Party in many of these sources. It was seen as a personal political fight. I'm often asked about whether there's any kind of dog whistle racism or xenophobia in these sources, and I will be honest with you, they don't necessarily target Sadiq Khan in that way. Instead, they target him as authoritarian, and I'll talk more about that on the next slide. We can kind of see as we're moving in this graph, the war on motorists and resistance to ULEZ and self-taxation. These are often very much linked and provide a core narrative of opposition against this scheme. So in terms of Sadiq Khan, as I mentioned, it's a personal project for him. It is seen as one, as a personal project and one that he will pursue at all costs. The science behind it is questioned, with it asserted in these sources that Sadiq Khan cherry-picked scientific evidence to justify this, but often as well that he would run roughshod in consultation processes as well. So it is seen as, in many ways, a mayor of London pushing forward a scheme which people don't want. And the reason given for this is because it is a stealth tax raising scheme. So instantly, this ULEZ stops being a public health measure and becomes one of a narrative of local government overreach and money grabbing in particular.
4 minutes, Ed. 4 minutes.
Cool. The second scheme that we want to talk about here is the war on drivers. And this is where it gets really interesting in class identity. Is the reliance upon cars in London is articulated as a key part of class identity, and with it, a pushback against it and a policy against it is seen as a new terrain of class antagonism. The war on drivers through ULEZ, through self-taxation, is defined as a war on the working class. And importantly, in this quote, we can see how the working class is becoming defined as well. And this is where I want to go with Just Stop Oil as well. In this quote from Lois Perry, who leads CAR 26, which is an anti-ULEZ campaign group, Lois argues that this isn't a war on motorists, this is a war on everyone, and importantly, on the working class. A new antagonism is being formed here, with the car, the internal combustion engine in particular, being the main conduit of that antagonism between government overreach and an elite pushing down on the working class. And Just Stop Oil factor into this as well, because Just Stop Oil becomes seen as embarrassingly middle class and out of touch in how they are presented. They are seen as entitled and not living in the real world. They don't work for a living, as this quote says to Patrick Christie says in May 2023. And this links back to broader characterizations of climate movements such as Extinction Rebellion, which are seen as middle class pursuits, pushing down on working class people who are just trying to get through day-to-day life. But Just Stop Oil's coverage is different because there's a shift here. We're not just seeing evidence of Just Stop Oil being understood as entitled, we're also seeing increased reporting on the working class fight back, in inverted commas, against this movement. So Just Stop Oil become only one side of the class antagonism, with the people fighting back showing their common sense values and almost an emergent anti-environmentalism, pushing back against what they see as holding them back from day-to-day life, but also their identity as drivers, as commuters, as working class people in trades and making their way through the economic life. And this quote on the slide gives a very good example of it. Patrick Christie's again talks about how it's only a risk that someone seriously batter a protester, because the common working man and women will not listen, will not hold back from these eco-numpties, these middle class people who are holding them back from change. And I guess, and I don't want to rush this a bit too much, but I'm conscious of time, is this an emergent class antagonism that we need to start thinking of discursively and starting to conceptualize fully. And that's why I'm excited to be part of this panel. It speaks to a political importance of the petty bourgeoisie, this kind of the working class groups in the UK, who are often seen as the median voter. And importantly, as Dan Evans' book says, consumption is becoming a key way of understanding that class antagonism. Not just going back to the 90s when people were understood in terms of the cars that they owned, or being on the motorway, or what TV they watched, or what type of home they lived in. But class identity in terms of middle class and upper class people is becoming linked to these goods and these items of consumption as well. People often talking about coffee being a middle class pursuit, pretending they don't drink it, despite being Labour MPs and Labour mayors. So if identity and class identity is rooted in consumption, so is the antagonism that is emerging around it. ULEZ becomes a war on motorists, and in doing so becomes part of a war on the working class, or as Lois Perry says, the working class. There's many problems of this that I won't dig into too much here, particularly around who is seen as working class and how they are included. However, if we go back all the way to, Stuart Hall's coming up a lot at the moment, mainly because there's a nice parallel between the UK political context when he was writing in the 80s and today. But if we go back to Hall's essays in 1958, we can see about how commodities are becoming signifiers of class, but importantly as well, the antagonism around class. This hasn't gone away. It's finding new forms and new items and new forms of consumption, new insignias of class and status. And this is really important because what's happening with these discourses is the climate and public health measures that I've discussed are being drawn into a broader culture war. The quote from Neil Oliver links several different items and seven different forms of consumption and class into a broader narrative in which the elite are pushing down on the people. On the top right of this slide is a sticker that I found in my local bus stop, linking COVID to the 15-minute cities idea. This isn't going away. It's becoming more antagonistic as time goes on. And I'd argue as well that as GB News' viewing figures increase, we're going to be seeing these narratives kind of cutting through into everyday life a bit more as well. So I apologise to John because I know that I've gone over time, but I will leave it there. Thank you very much for listening.
Only momentarily. Thanks, Ed. Don't forget, everybody, questions into the Q&A if you have any. Thanks, Ed. That was fantastic. I enjoyed that enormously, and I'm looking forward to seeing the thread emerging between these different presentations. And without further ado, Aurora, you're our next speaker. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, John. And thank you for inviting me to this event. I'm really excited to be here. I'm also a little bit nervous because I represent the whole pink quota here. So I feel I have a really big responsibility. Also, I don't have a presentation, so I'll try to make these as interactive as possible. I hope I won't bore you too much. But I'm presenting a piece of work that develops out of my PhD research. So I'm a critical security scholar, which means that my main area of study is security and security practice. Security intended as police and military mainly, and how this translates into certain ways of doing politics. And the reason why I'm introducing my work as within the security area of study is because the idea of how I built my own research really wanted and aimed at making a contribution for my field of work. So I work with a specific theory that is called securitization. I'm sure you're familiar with it. If not, I'll try to explain in a very simple way. And again, the theory in itself is important because it gave me the kind of framework within which to work with infrastructure and to kind of like shape and guide my method and then the methodological thinking behind it. As I said, this work started with a PhD research. I published this work in a book that is called Fueling Insecurity. I conducted research on energy and energy securitization in Azerbaijan. As I said, what is this securitization? Securitization points to processes that transform a specific issue, a specific political problem, social problem into a security concern. Usually in the theory, the idea is that we focus a lot on threat construction. You might have heard the term or be familiar with it because it has become extremely popular with regards to migration. So how migration has moved from a socioeconomic concern towards a security one. I did the same thing for energy. So I was trying to look how the problem of energy security became a problem of access, affordability, efficiency. You frame it as you want. There are different ways of framing it. moving from this variety of concern, this variety of questions, it moved closer and closer to the traditional security domain. So how the energy security became also a problem and a practice within traditional security sectors. I focused on military and police, and my case study was Azerbaijan. As I said, after that I published this work, I started wondering, I felt that something was missing. I had different research interests. I'm sure for those of you, especially the early career researchers, this is something that we don't discuss much, but it happens. You work so much on a project and you just get bored of it and you want to change, or you get different interests, and that is exactly what happened to me. But this new way of reading the problems that I was analyzing helped me to kind of push my work forward. And the different interests that I was developing were in emotions. Emotions are growing as a field of research, as a question of concerns. And the interesting aspect is that emotions are not so much present in the securitization literature. However, they are relevant. The way we feel about security, or security in itself, can be seen as a feeling. I feel secure or I feel insecure. The interesting aspect of what I'm saying is that usually securitization, as this process of threat construction, is analyzed through discourse. Ed before mentioned the concept of imaginaries, right? Well, imaginaries are very often discussed when it comes to this interaction between energy and security, how certain imaginaries or certain expectations, certain ways of envisioning our societies drive our energy policies and energy security policies. And while this is extremely important, part of my PhD work was to analyze security practices on the field. So I had kind of like a swift from a focus on discourse and imaginary to a focus on practices. And I didn't want to lose that, even if when trying to include emotions in my work, discourse seemed the most obvious methodological choice, or at least the easiest one, because how do we study emotions? Well, usually they are studied discursively. Unless we consider, instead of emotions per se, affect, that is again another concept that we have at our disposal, but usually affect that comes from the feminist tradition takes a specific takes a specific approach on emotion starting from the body. And I couldn't do that because I was analyzing practices and objects that weren't so much human in their way, in their nature. They were so far away from the body, or at least I perceived them so far away. So I wanted to, I don't know what's happening, but it wasn't me. Okay, good. So I wanted to make sure that I could keep this approach, that on the one side I had this idea of threat construction, on the other threat management, looking at how emotion interacted with the two in the energy sector, but trying again to take an approach and a perspective or a framework that could include the more material aspect. So as probably hopefully I'll make clear, my work was really like aimed at combining the social aspect, the discursive aspect with the more material one and the objects. As said, well, I wanted to look at emotions, and one of the emotions that I focused on, or actually the main emotions that I focused on, was pride. The reason why I chose pride, there are several reasons. The first one, very simple, I could see it everywhere. And when I say that I could see it everywhere, probably is also the way, that you can start playing in your head with this idea that, yes, I want to look at a feeling. So again, something that I felt that it was everywhere. And at the same time, something very material that I could see, I could touch. So it wasn't just the interpretation, but it was me being in a physical environment and try to understand how emotions were traveling in the environment that I was analyzing. And again, so studying securitization, when you think, if you're not familiar with the framework, doesn't really matter. If you think about security and insecurity, probably the most obvious emotions that you can think about is fear, because usually security is attached to questions of fear. Since securitization has become, as I said, very prevalent in questions of migration or climate change, there's anxiety, there's unease, all these quite negative emotions. And I wanted to look at pride. Pride, as I frame it in my article, is I frame it as a positive emotion. Of course, this might also not be so positive. When we have too much pride, we become quite nasty. But the idea is that I wanted to look at an emotion that kind of reinforced that idea of the self. And as I said, I could see pride everywhere in Azerbaijan while analyzing energy securitization. And I could see it because energy, of course, there was a discourse, I analyzed texts. So in terms of methods and methodology, I analyzed texts that were security policies. But I said, and then I analyzed practices. In this text, pride was a major component of the way the discourse on energy security in Azerbaijan was securitized, because it was about the nation being a successful energy exporter, being one of the greatest and most productive country of oil and gas, being able, such a small country, such a very often forgotten country, being able to support Europe and the West, to collaborate and cooperate with the West, a country that has a strong and very recent Soviet past. So all these discourses were based on conceptualizations of identity, of course, but it was a prideful identity. So there was this dimension that it was so obvious to me that there was an element or a degree of pride. But then when conducting my fieldwork and rereading...
4 minutes, thanks, Aurora. Sorry for interrupting.
Sure, this was quick. I could see also that it was in the buildings that I was looking. So, if you go to Baku, you see these huge buildings about oil. For example, there's the Flame Tower, the fact that the city was rebuilt using oil money, and that moved from the denomination of a black town to the white city. So I could see the opulence. And therefore, in my methodology, and we can discuss that later, because obviously the webinar is formulated around a theoretical and methodological question, the empty signifier. I don't use the Laclau and Mouffe framework for several reasons that we can discuss later in the Q&A. I go for a new materialist approach that really tried, instead of looking at the empty dimension of discourse, try to kind of put it on the same level, the discourse and the materiality. So I picked some of the material elements that I could see, I could feel, that I lived when I was there, and tried to look at how they influenced discourse and how discourse was influenced by them. So trying to keep them ontologically at the same level. And basically, I'll conclude on this aspect. While this has a lot of benefits in terms of theory and methods and the empirical findings that I got, I also want to invite you to think that when we try to think about infrastructure building objects, we want, of course, to deflect the attention from the human, right? This is something that is the primary focus of any discourse or imaginary framework, because the interpretation comes from our nature of being human. However, when we take a different approach that includes the object, that includes the infrastructure, we're giving agency also to the material and the matter. Of course, I'm dealing with very problematic and controversial issues of politics and policy. So when thinking about agency here, we have ethical questions that we need to take in consideration. So on this note, I'll end here. I hope there will be a moment in the Q&A where I can clarify what I haven't clarified here during my brief presentation, but that's the work I've been doing. So thank you so much.
Yes, I'm Josh Kirshner, and then Barnaby is going to be is going to discuss the three papers. And so I'll start my talk now, if it's okay. I'm presenting a project I worked on that examines what we call infrastructural histories and legacies of three corridors. And I'll talk more about what we mean by corridors. In this case, we're looking at Mozambique, but this is a kind of a broader concept and practice. And we're looking at corridors centered on three cities in Mozambique. Underpinned by physical infrastructures, corridors were central to the extractive European colonial enterprise in Africa. And these corridors facilitated flows. These corridors facilitated flows of resources, goods, knowledge, flows between them, between metropoles, African urban centers, and their hinterlands during the colonial period. And nowadays, corridors insert African cities and regions into global circuits of capital that, as we suggest, perpetuate past extractive practices and policies. They're also powerful imaginary spaces for advancing particular political projects and developing specific types of government or configurations of government. So we want to develop this idea that the corridor as an idea can remain useful over time, even as claims about whether they're appropriate or necessary ebb and flow at different periods. So we're kind of developing two arguments. One connects to this idea about empty signifiers and sort of diverse ways of understanding and fluid ambitions around these corridors. And then a second argument is that we look at the investments in these corridors and we reflect on their role in building up a new contemporary economy in Mozambique, but one that rests and is deeply entangled with the country's colonial past. So first, to just discuss this notion of empty signifiers a bit. So we draw on this idea, and my co-author and I, that's Idolina Baptista, and we explore the way that these corridors have become a very durable idea, even though they refer to a lot of different types of things on the ground. And this is through the notion of empty signifiers. So this is you can see on the bullets here, it's a free-floating container of multiple meanings, histories, and practices, drawing here on Laclau and Mouffe. And so it makes it possible to explain how certain words or phrases acquire political importance and how ongoing political struggles seek to establish the definition of certain terms, and that would then give them relevance for social processes. And so this draws on wider conceptions of discourse as proposed by a range of different theorists, again, Laclau and Mouffe, but also other post-structuralist and postmodern theorists like Foucault and Saussure and Derrida. And so these thinkers have emphasized the importance of discourse for constructing reality while highlighting the connection between language, knowledge, and power. And so different kinds of meanings in this point of view have fluidity and can never be entirely fixed. And that opens space for struggles over definitions and the emergence even of counter-hegemonic narratives. So in what I'm presenting, I'm again focusing on these three corridors, which you can see on the map. This is actually an image that came out of a World Bank report that showed several different corridors proposed for Mozambique, but I'm focusing on the three main ones that are centered on three cities, Maputo in the far south. And actually, I can show these boxes here. This is the central one in Beira, centered on the city of Beira, but linking with resource-rich Tet province, which is over to the western side of Mozambique, heading towards Zimbabwe and Zambia. And then, excuse me, thirdly in the north, the Nacala corridor, which also links to Tet province, which is a very resource-rich area, Malawi and Zimbabwe, and even beyond into Katanga province in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is another resource-rich region. And these corridors harbor different sets of ambitions that historically have structured Mozambique's economic geography. And so if you wanted to look further at what I'm presenting for more detail, this paper is available. I think it could be open access. And so just to briefly step back a bit and talk about corridors in Africa more broadly, and also more specifically in Mozambique, the idea of economic development corridors may be a creation of the sort of late 1990s and early 2000s. That's kind of when the idea really started to be promoted by governments. But notions of linear development in the African context have this much longer history. And so, for instance, railways have been very central to this, and as one author put it, the ultimate extractive tool of empire. In post-colonial Africa, railways have been key to the consummation of what some scholars have called the infrastructural state, to quote Michael Mann, although at times only symbolically. And indeed, enhanced freight connectivity through combinations of transport infrastructures, railways, roads, ports, pipelines, and airports are now key to the development of African economies. And in many respects, contemporary development corridors are reiterations of older imperial projects, especially those that are underpinned by railway infrastructures. Development corridors connect spaces of extraction to spaces of consumption through myriad nodes and spaces of exception, if you will. So that's referring to special economic zones and enclaves, drawing on work such as by Easterling. And so, to quote Enz and Bersaglio, two geographers who've looked at corridors in East Africa, in particular in Kenya, visions and territorial plans of colonial administrators are reappearing in visions and plans for these new mega infrastructure corridors today, underpinned by older imaginations of connectivity. And post-colonial infrastructure projects seem to reinstate and revise the imaginaries of older imperial projects that were designed to connect and integrate Africa in a relationship of dependency in Europe. And in some ways, we want to draw on this history of an idea of Euro-Africa, Europe and Africa in the post-war period, an effort to kind of think more clearly about integrating Africa into Europe in this post-war period. And so examining the infrastructural histories of corridors, how they've been imagined and implemented by colonial and post-colonial governments is, we think, a helpful way to think through how African populations have experienced different types of disconnection and connection over time. And in looking more specifically at Mozambique, these corridors have been quite central to Mozambique. You can see on the map, it's kind of a long, narrow country in some ways. And arguably the infrastructural histories of these corridors that cut across, not going north-south through the country, but going across from the cities of Maputo in the south, Beira in the central coastal region, and Nacala in the northern coastal region, are grounded in commercial and migration routes of diverse ethnic groups that precede colonial occupation. And then Portuguese colonial interests, as well as those of other nations, notably British, repurposed these corridors to service an extractive economy, mostly by building other kinds of transport infrastructure and kind of using that to ground and anchor other types of development along these corridors. And so looking again at this idea of Euro-Africa, Europe-Africa, which was a concept that was being promoted in Europe in the post-war period, Portugal had a kind of an interesting role to play here. They had occupied and colonized Mozambique and Angola and a few other territories for several centuries. When European powers in the post-war period were seeking to decolonize these spaces, Portugal was actually in the post-war period wanting to enhance its colonies and kind of further integrate them. And this was happening under the dictator Salazar in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And in 1951, Salazar proposed a new geographical integration project, a vision of a pluricontinental Portugal that proposed a new geopolitical integration of its own, kind of separate from the Euro-Africa project. And that involved a political integration and sort of retaining this vision of Portugal as a great nation with a civilizing mission and an imaginary that covered over and obscured some of the oppression and injustice taking place through the colonial enterprise. And a now infamous map that was produced under Portugal's propaganda services in 1934 claimed that Portugal is not a small country. You can see Portugal não é país pequeno in the top left corner of this map. And indeed, if you put the territories of Portuguese colonial regime juxtaposed against Europe, it is quite large and takes up much of what's now Europe. And so this kind of shows, we think by the producers of this map, not only the vast territorial extension juxtaposed on European territory, but also the attendant possibilities for resource exploitation. And so maybe I'll just hold on that slide for a minute. In the post-colonial period, corridor projects in Mozambique have retained the purpose of facilitating service economies into neighboring countries. And we detail a little bit in the article the way that under the late Portuguese colonial regime, there were these certain economic development plans that focused on these corridors. And then, sort of building on more historical connections. But what's interesting is that in the post-colonial period, after a 10-year struggle against colonialism in the 1960s, and then following a civil war in Mozambique that ensued after independence in 1975, these corridors kind of come back into prominence, and that's what we were interested in teasing out. So the first that we explore is the Maputo corridor, which is often called the MDC, the Maputo Development Corridor. And it's interestingly tied more to South Africa, and you really have to look at what's happening in South Africa at that time. And this is taking place in the mid-1990s, just following the end of apartheid and following the first democratic elections in South Africa, and really South Africa's kind of reinsertion into the global economy, no longer being subject of sanctions, and kind of rediscovering its links following this long period of 4 decades of state-sanctioned or state-led apartheid, where it was really an inward-looking economy. South Africa wants to sort of suddenly rediscover its neighbors, and you can see on the right these different spatial development initiatives, which was the term that used at the time. And one is the Maputo Development Corridor, which I've circled there in red. And then you can see the more specific detail of it on the left. And this was as part of Mandela's post-apartheid growth, employment, and redistribution program, which sought to reintegrate South Africa into these surrounding economies. And from Mozambique, this is taking place also alongside the end of Civil War.
Sorry to interrupt, Josh, but you've got 3 more minutes.
Oh, okay. So I think I'm not going to be able to go into the specifics of all 3 of the corridors. But essentially what we found with this case of the Maputo Development Corridor is that it has become actually now the most successful of these SDIs. It's sort of 25 years on from this late 1990s period. It's often considered the one that has really come to fruition the most. And the government of South Africa actually called off the plan. In 2004, a group of investors and service providers that span public and private sectors launched a nonprofit Maputo Corridor Logistics Initiative. So it suggests in some ways the staying power of this idea, but the government itself withdrew its support. And we think that's largely because the infrastructure was built and there was kind of a waning discussion of the MDC. And that kind of points to its long-term success, and the mobilizing narrative is no longer needed while the approach continues. And so if I had longer, I would go into these 2 other corridors. One is in the center and kind of focuses more on agricultural development, and one is in the north that also focuses on agricultural development. And these kind of have not really come to fruition. And what we try to suggest is that this idea of corridor is used more as a mobilizing narrative to try to mobilize investment, in some ways to even cover over the lack of effects that it's had on local residents, beneficial effects mainly, and sort of use this idea of corridor to sort of keep the plan going, even though it hasn't really taken shape on the ground. So just to conclude, corridors serve as empty signifiers for fluid ambitions of connectivity, competitiveness, and economic dynamism, while obscuring similar forms of exclusion, violence, and exploitation in the colonial past, which I haven't been able to go into very much. And as the geographer Charisse Enns argues, the corridor agenda has been constructed on an imaginary of a seamless Africa, as new corridors are promised to enable flows of capital, commodities, and people to circulate with ease across space and between scales. And so we really think that this is kind of an interesting way to kind of compare these different experiences thus far, and such opportunities for developing these corridors may gain momentum at certain times, such as the MDC, which I went into a little bit more in the kind of period just after apartheid. This space is suggestive of, in some ways, a creative potential that corridors may hold amid ongoing territorial reconfigurations and their uneven effects on local communities. So I'll stop there and stop sharing the screen. Thanks very much.
So yeah, I have the job of trying to draw out some connections between these three very interesting papers and offering some thoughts on them. Yeah, first of all, thanks. I really enjoyed all three of them. And I think sort of the thing that comes to mind first, and is perhaps the most obvious, is just how political infrastructure can be, and the way in which you can explore it in these very different dynamics, but it can involve everything from emotions to identity to strategic political plans, materialist interests, history, security, and just how important it is to see infrastructure not just in its material form, but in these other ways in which it has an effect on society and is shaped and shapes politics. I wondered, particularly for your presentation, Aurora, how if you sort of were thinking about some of the other comparative infrastructure projects that are perhaps in the country, but also in the wider region, and how there are other cases of such infrastructure really embodying ideas of national pride and nationalism. One that comes to my mind because of my study of dams is, I think, in the large high dam in Tajikistan. But it seems like that's something that's you can also be embodied in new cities, as you're focusing on. But perhaps that sort of context and international comparison is an interesting angle to that work. For Josh's paper, I found it very interesting. I had some sort of questions about how far you can take the sort of neo-colonial approach. I think it does. There's it's really interesting to try and map out how these are replicating longer historical patterns, longer historical plans. I think the resurrection of plans from the 1940s to the 1960s is a really interesting phenomenon in Africa more broadly. And I think that the idea of corridors as this particularly extractive tool probably works better in Mozambique than in some other contexts. But it does seem like there's some significant shifts in how the corridor is being used and its political economy, which I find sometimes in that work, especially the Enns and Presiglio paper that you also quoted. For me, it sort of doesn't quite bring out some of the changes that are happening, particularly when there's a real political economy push to change a country's role within the wider global value chain, within the wider political economy, to change its structural position so that it's not just the corridors aren't just a form of primary extraction, but are starting to produce and be involved in more manufacturing, more refining. And you see this in corridors more to the north of Mozambique, as far as I know. But in Tanzania, they were really seen as a tool of industrialization, and so that's a very different model to how they were originally conceived as this more extractive colonial tool linking to Europe. Of course, the other big context is how they're now really about linking to China, probably, and some of the other Southeast Asian industrial centers, which is then also where I think the sort of neo-colonial narrative at least needs some clarification. And the other thing I think is interesting about how what's changed over time, again, there's some continuities and discontinuities, is the role of infrastructure as a state building tool. And I wonder if you sort of explored that a bit in this project. In Mozambique, there's quite a long history of these infrastructure projects being a way of projecting the power of the state and taking and sort of gaining more control of territory. That also seemed like an interesting angle, which has perhaps a different role post-colonially as it does colonially, or perhaps there's some similarity there. But sort of one of the connections I think between the three papers which I don't think any of you or perhaps Ed has slightly more thoroughly, but more directly, I should say, but is the sort of role of ideology within these three. And I mean, this is something I'm interested in my own work. I've thought about modernist ideologies and how they've influenced infrastructure project planning and had this sort of trajectory from being constructed in the mid 20th century, but seems to continue over time. But I think sort of exploring ideology also in terms of emotions, as you did, Aurora, and how that sort of links to nationalism. Of course, in Josh's paper with Adelina, the role of development ideologies and how people are imagining what development looks like, I think is an interesting theme. And of course, in your work, Ed, the way in which infrastructure is being used by the far right, I think, and the sort of ideology, I suppose, underpinning that of something. I don't know if you would use ideology or want to define sort of the ideology that you think is being created through this climate antagonism. But that seemed like an interesting theme between the three papers. Another one is about the energy transition. And again, this is sort of more of a comment, and I think how another connection between the three, but how political, I suppose a trend that we're just going to see more and more and more of is us trying to understand the politics of this transition. And of course, your paper, Ed, sort of perhaps tackles that most directly, but I think it's very much present in the imaginaries of development in Africa. And again, there's strong connections to corridors around building hydropower or other forms of renewable energy, which are increasingly integrated into these corridor projects and seen as part of how they're fueled. I think in your paper, Aura, there's a sort of interesting angle to understanding how the transition can be structurally or sort of not structurally, but blocked by deeper societal pride and identity. So I think sort of understanding the transition from these different political angles, understanding the role of identity, of fears and emotions attached to them, I think is a really interesting theme. And I wonder, or if you sort of have thought about this in your work on securitization, it seems like, at least from sort of reading policy documents, that in the last couple of years, climate change has become something that's increasingly viewed for a security lens as threats, as something to be worried about, and there's sort of this advancing agenda of soft security, of needing to make sure that you're have disaster resilience and that sort of language. So I wondered if that's something that you had looked at in connection with that case study. I think that's probably all from me, but thanks again, and look forward to any other questions people have that they want to ask. But perhaps first of all, shall I come back to the panelists? in the order that you spoke, and then we can see if there's any other questions that have cropped up.
Thanks, Barnaby. Yeah, there's some really interesting points threaded throughout that discussion. On the point of ideology, it's not something I think of a lot. In all honesty, I think, yeah, it does come up a lot in discussions of infrastructure, and increasingly so in terms of climate action, energy transition, because of the infrastructure it entails and the vast changes it necessitates. But I don't think that means that, my lack of exploring it fully, it denotes its absence. I think there is ideology present in all of our cases and everything we're discussing, and what is common between them is how messy it is, and how that kind of can challenge how we conceptualize the discourse around ideology and how ideology finds discursive form. In my case, I think ideology becomes intricately linked to automobility and the reliance on car as a form of identity builder, and how that has become ideologically quite sedimented. And I think if I was to go back to kind of like the big topic of empty signifiers here, the empty signifier here is the car. It's, it is transport. It is private transport in particular, which is filled with meanings of freedom and comfort and protection and safety and the school run and public transport being awful, and they're taking it away. And that's kind of where the ideology creeps in. But yeah, that's what I have to say on that. So I'll leave it to the other panelists to kind of answer your other questions. But thank you very much.
I guess it's my turn. Okay, so thanks for the questions, Barnaby, really interesting. So in terms of the comparative dimension of my work, I didn't do any comparison with other projects. Of course, I read a lot from the literature, especially from geography, on, for example, dams, your work as well. But I didn't do that comparative work because I was doing it in ethnographic type of field work, so it didn't really make sense for me to look at other cases outside Azerbaijan. What I can say that is that, and I take the opportunity also to develop a little bit the work that I did and didn't have the chance during my own presentation, is that when looking at energy, especially energy conceptualized in terms of oil and gas within Azerbaijan, is actually a very unique example. There's nothing that can be compared to the level and the impact of oil and gas on the nation and the national identity, but also on every single aspect that you can imagine of. The Azerbaijan is self-named as the land of fire, and this fire comes from the fact that in the territory, just beneath the soil, there's so much gas that just the soil forms fire on its own. So the presence of the resource is what makes Azerbaijan. It ties with questions of religion, because obviously these spontaneous fire were one of the main kind of like point of religious manifestation in terms of Zoroastrian religion. It's also a country that moved from Zoroastrian tradition to Muslim, and this idea of fire and oil and gas was reconceptualized, but it was still part of how the faith was professed. It has to do also with obviously the fact that Azerbaijan was the first place on the earth where oil was extracted. So it ties with the history of world capitalism, it ties with the Soviet colonization, and then the independence from the Soviet industry, the creation of the oligarchy. I didn't clarify it, but one of the aspects of Azerbaijan that makes it also an interesting case is that after its independence, it has been ruled by dictatorship, a family dictatorship. Well, we can name it in different ways. Of course, I come from a political science tradition, so names matter in terms of how we conceptualize the regime, but in itself we can simplify it as a dictatorship, and it has to do with the fact that the ruling family was able to monopolize the control over access over oil. So it ties with so many aspects of what the country is materially, not just socially, that it is really difficult to find any other industry or any other material that has the same symbolic and material impact on what the country is and what the country does. What I found extremely interesting about what you were saying about modernism it's, again, the case of Azerbaijan is fascinating because the industry that exists, although it's a multi-billion dollars industry, the facilities, the infrastructure is really old, and it comes from Soviet times. So we're talking about early 20th century. The modernism that comes and that is tied and with the industry is not so much the oil and gas industry per se, or the oil and gas infrastructure, but it's more the infrastructure. So the city that was built thanks to the money that came from the energy industry. So the modernization that we see is not so much in the infrastructure, in the technology that is used to extract oil and gas, which is the same, and very likely is going to be the same, because if we think about energy insecurities, the problem that the country has is a very poor and old infrastructure that doesn't really work as it should. But still, the modernization is not so much about the technology, but it is about the culture and the social infrastructure that exists. And just to finalize and answer your last question about climate change, when we look at securitization in terms of theory and practice, one of the key points, the political point of securitization, is that one of the objectives that it has is to keep the status quo, because by keeping the status quo, we keep power structures as they are in place. And security plays very well with this idea of keeping power as it is, not to touch it. Things that can resonate with the case of colonization, right? But anyway, so this idea of keeping the status quo that is material, as I said, and symbolic at the same time, in Azerbaijan works against climate change and against what we would expect being an energy transition. Azerbaijan has zero interest in developing an alternative green industry that would put in danger the oil and gas that is number one source, not just of economy, but as I said, of national identity and the meaning of itself. So the securitization that we see in energy has very, very little to do with climate change or environmental impact that, as you can imagine, is enormous on a country that lives on oil and gas, and that produces but also extracts. So the level of contamination is so high that definitely the discourse would need some change. But this change isn't happening exactly because of what you were saying. All of this is so political that has very little to do with what we would expect the energy policy to be about. And I'll conclude here. Thanks.
Should I just maybe very quickly, because we do want to have some time for Q&A, but I guess I was interested in what you were saying, Barnaby, about the emphasis on the colonial period and the neo-colonial links that I gave in the presentation. And I was thinking about that and remembering that the project actually began from a, sometimes these things start from like a call for papers or something. And it was actually, it was meant to be a conference that was going to happen in Basel, Switzerland back in 2020 on coloniality of infrastructure. And also very, very central was this idea of Eurafrica, which I wasn't familiar with at the time. So I had to read up on Eurafrica as this kind of post-war project. And then with Idalina and I, we talked about it and thought that, it's interesting to look at Portugal because Portugal was formerly neutral in World War II, and then coming into the post-war period sort of took this very different trajectory from Britain and France and some of the other colonial powers. And then Idalina was researching some of this colonial history on her own for some other work she was doing. And I was interested in the corridors, and she was finding that a lot of the investment under Salazar was in these kind of corridor areas. So that's kind of how it started. So, but I do think you make a good point to maybe think more about what has changed and the ways that now there are these new players, and for instance, China, and we've also seen in Mozambique, there's quite a lot of investment coming from Turkey and India and various players. And then just, I guess, very briefly, the point about infrastructure and state building seems important. And so I guess when we talk about these different ambitions and the way that the corridors in some ways can be thought of as empty signifiers, because I didn't get to develop this too much because I didn't have time to go into these other cases. But what I wanted to emphasize with the two other corridors is that they haven't been defined nearly as well as the first one. So the first one kind of offers a sort of a counterpoint and really comes out of this more South African experience. And these other two have remained more undefined. But I think very much they're tied to state building and efforts by the state to kind of do certain things and kind of project its power in certain ways. And then, I mean, I don't want to go into this because it'll take up all the time, but the connections with energy transition would be interesting to think about as well. But I did see there was a question, I think, for Aurora in the Q&A.
Yes, I was actually typing my reply, but if you have a few minutes, I'll just... Yeah, so I did a lot of work. So, sorry, let me read the question out loud. So Heather asked me, Aurora talked about how pride was visible in modern Azerbaijan, the flame towers, for example. I wonder if you have done any systematic study of the historical element to this pride, common reference to the contract of the century, branding of Azerbaijan as the land of fire, common talk about Tagiyev and Azerbaijan being one of the early locations of the oil industry. Yes. So as I was mentioning before, I did a lot of kind of like work on these historical and more cultural elements that make pride. These were part of the book that I published, Fueling Insecurity. So I'm not naming the book for self-promotion, but it seems to me that you work on Azerbaijan. Sorry, my everything happening at the same time. So so if you are interested in that could be a way where, you know, you can get some of like a better idea of how I conducted that fieldwork and how I then work and rework on those historical elements, because I didn't frame them as historical. These weren't part of the context, but methodologically I approached the discourse analysis through a diffractive method that allowed me, like a sort of intertextuality would be called by linguistic. When you work on new materialism, since you're working also outside the text, is called diffractively. Again, tiny details. But this is a structural work that is part, as you call it, a systemic work that is part of the discourse analysis that I did.
I wonder if I could just ask a question to sort of my panel members, and Barnaby too, if you want. I mean, one thing that we I guess building on what Aurora was just saying, it struck me that we didn't talk much about our methodologies. And like, I was interested in the slide that Ed showed with, I think it was about the ULEZ, and you had these different boxes, and I wasn't quite sure like how you did that. And I mean, I could talk a little bit about my methodology too, and maybe we could all just chat about that briefly.
Yeah, so I'm trying to systematize how I approach discourse. So those boxes are through NVivo. So it's just an iterative coding process through that software. It's basically the computer version of using a highlighter, which is great. But yeah, I'm getting my head around it. So those boxes are based on the frequency of those codes being used in the sample. So the bigger the box, the more frequent. So Sadiq Khan is present in, I think at least a third of the sources I've looked at. So yeah, that's where that comes in. And when it comes to methodologies, I approach in a very iterative way. I'm always quite intrigued by what can come out. And there's a question in the Q&A about kind of counter-hegemonic narratives, and about whether there's space in the frameworks that we use. And I'd say, yes, that iterative iterative approach allows us to find those different framings, and how they might all fit together. So interestingly, my work is that counter-hegemonic narratives are actually the narratives that I'm tracing on GBNews. They are moving against the, government policy. But then there is also space for narratives to be analysed which counter those counter-hegemonic narratives, leading to the messiness, which is actually why systematising it does become quite helpful in how I approach this discourse and these kind of speech acts.
So in my work, well, in terms of the broader research that I did on securitization, I tried again to combine the discursive elements with the practice elements. So I did a discourse analysis, which was a Foucauldian discourse analysis. So say like the most straightforward way of doing discourse analysis beyond linguistics. So in a post-structuralist approach. And then I combined it with a mapping of practices. But then I moved to studying emotion, so the article that I published after this research after the book, that the methodology changed, because obviously I wasn't analyzing discourse and practices, but I was analyzing all together. So understanding that there's no practice without a discourse, and there's no discourse without a practice. So I came up with a methodological approach, and the article actually is about methodology. And basically the idea of what I did was really trying to understand what elements I was interested in and work simultaneously across dimensions. So considering the discourse, so the symbolic, the social construction, together with the material component of what could be, for example, capitalism and the physical transaction it would imply, or history, including from the territory, the wars, to national identities, questions of pride, and different feelings.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll just quickly comment to say that, like, I call this thing that I presented a discourse analysis, but I didn't do anything quantitative in order to sort of analyze the discourse. I didn't use any tools like in vivo or any of that. I mean, really what I did was, my co-author Idalina and I noticed these interesting ways that there was some reinvention of some of the colonial era stuff, and then we basically just sort of reconstructed some of the history and looked at these 3 examples and found that while the Maputo corridor had consisted of certain things, these other 2 corridors seemed much less defined, and just it was just more disparate. But that was just a sense that we got, qualitatively. We weren't able to really prove that, I would say. I mean, at one point I did just do, I mean, I'm not someone who's done like a systematic lit review, but I did just kind of, out of curiosity, I just looked up these corridors. And I did find that the Maputo corridor had a flowering of literature in the period when it was being promoted, sort of in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and then it kind of dropped off. And then these other ones, the other 2, did have articles more recently in the 2010s and into 2020 or so. But I mean, it was so few papers, it didn't really seem to add much to sort of quantify that. But so then I just kind of used some other work, and I actually drew on some work by Ed, which I told him about this, a previous paper of his about dams in Brazil that kind of draws on these ideas of Laclau and Mouffe and other kind of political theorists that have used this from the University of Essex, actually. I think they're known as the Essex School of, and this is a kind of political theory. It's people like David Holworth, and I wasn't familiar with this, but I found that some other studies had used those ideas. For instance, on energy infrastructure in Estonia, I think there was some work done on this, and so I thought it was just quite a productive thing to tap into. So I used that, but it was more just a kind of conceptual way to look at it. So I don't have any sort of quantitative analysis that can kind of confirm the ideas about why this discourse has been is still in use or this other one hasn't. But I will just then maybe quickly nod to the questions we got about the counter-hegemonic. And the example that we had there was the 3rd corridor in the far north, the Laclau corridor, got mixed up with this agro-investment project called Pro Savannah, which involved investment from Brazil and Japan. It was mainly sort of finance coming from Japan, and then expertise from Brazil in agro-industry mixed with really land from Mozambique. And this got involved in some, kind of tied into some dubious claims about unused lands. And so there started to be a critique of it from local people in that region of Mozambique that were organized into kind of peasant cooperatives. And then they actually linked up through the landless peasant movement with movements in Brazil that challenged some of this kind of project. And so it did become a kind of a opportunity for counter organizing against it that also used the concept of corridor. So that was interesting to explore, but it didn't really happen in the other 2 corridor examples.
And to add to that, Josh, I think there's a sort of small Marxist movement in South Africa, which often critiques these types of corridor developments in Africa, but it's quite rare to find strong counter-hegemonic discourses to the dominant development in many African countries, partly because of the sort of more authoritarian political context. But yeah, I think Ed's comments about the messiness of studying discourse and ideology is a really important one, and one I found in my own work. I've tended to use a more sort of manual highlighting interviews to assess the key themes that are coming up, and work in that iterative way, as you were saying, Ed, to try and understand what's there rather than trying to follow a sort of theory testing model. But I wonder if Aurora, you would want to answer this question about there being room for counter-hegemonic or competing narratives in the status quo discourse. It sounds from what you were saying before that there isn't, but it would be interesting to hear what space there is for that in Azerbaijan.
No, actually, I wanted to reply to the question. So thanks, Azim, for your question. It's extremely interesting, especially because obviously, as I said before, my area of specialization comes from politics. So that's core of a core question to my work. And in general, just replying to how you formulated your question, I would say that there is always room for counter-hegemonic or competing narratives, especially if you come from, again, a critical framework. I use Foucault, but again, you can choose the author that is closer to your area of interest. The way we conceptualize power is a relational way, which means that there's always, within power, there's always resistance. There's always a possibility to resist that power. The way that this hegemony unfolds depend also on the, let's say, audience, because we're talking about discourse, right? I'm thinking about Gramsci, I'm thinking about Foucault. There are many authors that you can read that will tell you that within power, there's always space for resistance. So yes, there's room. How you do it then in your research, it's a completely different question, in the sense that it depends on what you want to analyze and what you want to research. My main question wasn't so much about the possibility of resistance. It was about how this hegemonic narrative emerged in the first place and how it was manifested, how it was politicized, how it was securitized. So for me, the important piece, the first piece, was to try to clarify how there was an hegemonic narrative in the first place, how this narrative wasn't just one of those discourses, but was really engineered in the way politics happened. So again, my objective wasn't so much about finding this narrative or hegemonic discourses. However, there are so many ways of looking for resistance and alternative narratives, especially if you focus on discourse. Discourse is having like let's say a less material manifestation of this resistance, really emerges everywhere. It really depends on the voices that you are analyzing. Again, I was thinking about politics, I was thinking about the regime, I analyzed the regime, so I really focused on the main source of power. But even just the fact that there are some NGOs working in Azerbaijan that really want to try with now very little success, but this doesn't matter, to put forward an energy transition, it also says something. And that this energy transition is discussed in terms of energy, but still talks about the oligarchy, still talks about the lack of diffusion of power. It is, again, a form of resistance. So to answer your question in just one word, it would be yes, there's always room.
Just to build on that, I think, yeah, Aurora's totally right. As any approach to discourse needs to take into account what is the dominant one, but also how that's being contested and where and by whom. It's also worth noting there's an extra layer there, which is that dominant narratives can co-opt counter-hegemonic narratives as well. And that's something when actually we see liberalism as an ideology, as go back to ideology from Barnaby, liberalism is based on that. It is in many ways co-opting narratives and discourses and demands from what were previously radical emancipatory struggles into a new kind of status quo. So there's all these movements happening around these different narratives. And I guess kind of go back to Azerbaijan and Aurora's work, is that COP will be rolling into town in Azerbaijan soon. So we'll hopefully see lots of counter-hegemonic narratives there. What will happen with them, will be worthy of study and worthy of looking at closer.
Yeah, I'd say that in the case studies I've looked at, especially in Rwanda, the acts of resistance don't tend to come from constructing an alternative narrative, but sort of trying to keep the rulers to the existing narrative that they were putting forward. So the promises they were making, and having a discourse of, oh, well, you haven't delivered what you said you were going to deliver, and trying to insist on development in that way, because there isn't really space to come out in opposition entirely to the government. But yeah, it's a great point about COP, as I was thinking about that through the presentation. I think we're nearly at time, so probably we should wrap up here, unless there's any more questions from the audience.
Yeah, I mean, just to briefly say, it's a shame we couldn't all get together in person. But yeah, I was encouraged to set up this event originally by John Enser, who's the one who introduced us at the start. And yeah, I think it's been about a year since we've had the idea, so it's just really nice we were finally able to do it. And thanks everyone who came along and had to listen and ask some questions.